When it comes to certain writers in anime, there's probably a few good names that immediately come to mind as being some of the god tiers of the media in the past 2 decades and a bit. You could probably name a few off the top of your head, like Hayao Miyazaki, Reiko Yoshida, Hiroyuki Imaishi, Masaki Yusa, Hiroyoshi Onogi, and Niso Isin. It was probably more than a few, but you get my point. There's been a lot of really great writers in this past period of time, but the one I feel like deserves the most praise out of all of them is Gen Urobuchi. Urobuchi has been around in the medium of writing for a while, having had his name to such works in the mediums like visual novels, light novels, anime, and even tokusatsu. And there's a specific brand of his writing which I feel like makes his works that much more unique. And it's the way that they start with such a simple premise of the genre in which he's been tasked with writing for, and then proceeds to make the story that much more miserable as a result over time. And that got me thinking recently, given the announcement that after nearly a decade of any new Madoka Magica content that isn't related to spin-offs, we're finally getting the sequel to Rebellion in Walpurgis Night Rising later this year. It made me utter something I never thought I'd ever say. What the hell ever happened to Gen Urobuchi? Because from the mid-2000s to the tail end of the 2010s, the man who would be known as the Urobutcher went from making some of the best pieces of the media that very year it came out in, sometimes even twice over in some cases, to over time slowly becoming less and less prominent in the anime and Japanese media scene in general over time. Which I feel is a shame, but it kinda got me thinking as well that maybe there's an inherent reason behind it. So today's video is going to be looking at the works of Gen Urobuchi, talk about what I love, what I don't love, and try and figure out the answer to the question of what makes the Urobutcher so great of a writer, as well as maybe figure out why he's dropped off in recent years. So yeah, it only makes sense to start with the work that made Urobuchi what he is infamously known for today. Saya no Uta, or The Song of Saya, is a short visual novel which was released in 2003, following the point of view of a medical student who suffered an interesting brain injury wherein he perceives the world as being fleshy and covered in organs. Yeah, remember how I said that looking at Urobuchi's work was a sudden step into the uncomfortable and miserable nature by the end? That wasn't always the case. Anyway, the condition he has almost leaves him in a state of depression where he almost ends his life as a result of it, until he sees the titular Saya, whom is seen to our point of view as being this lovely girl in a white dress, but in reality is an eldritch horror who drives those around her to madness if they gaze upon her. It's a short 5-hour visual novel at best, and is honestly a good read all throughout as an early showing of Urobuchi's work. I just would honestly recommend it less over his more recent works because of how visually disgusting it is, as well as just being how gruesome the writing can be throughout it. And given you'll be reading this instead of seeing it visually play out like most of the other works we'll be covering here, the writing and still visuals are 2 key points of focus that I need to be mentioned for that as a result. Not to mention that the themes in this story are very grim from the get-go and unfortunately don't get that much better as, while your choices are very linear until the ending you want to get is presented, the themes and writing of codependency issues, mental health struggles, and many other things I cannot mention due to demonetization being a thing. That being said, if you look this up on VNDB, look at the tags and don't feel an immediate disgust hit the pit of your stomach, I'd honestly recommend it, as while it is a tough one to read through 100%, it is also a very good starting point for anything that Urobuchi writes in the future. As for better or for worse, he'd revisit a lot of the concepts brought out in Saya no Uta to honestly much better written effects in the works we're looking at the moment, even down to the outright disgusting imagery in some of the stories we'll be looking at, and even how some of the characters will go down mentally in their own mentally ill cycles. A perfect example of that being his immediate next work that he wrote. Ha! You all thought it'd be Fate Zero next. God help me, I wish it was, honestly. But honestly here, Kikokugai is important to bring up as well for a similar reason as, like Saya no Uta, the concepts of which were brought up in this would later be revisited to better effect in Gen's later works. As like another work we'll be covering in this video, Kikokugai, the Cyber Slayer, is a cyberpunk story in the vein of stories in series like Ghost in the Shell and Bubblegum Crisis before it. Technically, however, I talked about these two out of order as Kikokugai came out a year before Uta did in 2002. But let's be honest here, if I started the video off elsewhere, you would have turned off immediately. I see you all in the analytics! But also, in reality, it's because Kikokugai, being one of Urobuchi's first works alongside Saya, is very clear when you look at the writing of it, as, like Saya no Uta, it's very one-note, and kind of one-track minded, and, once again, not giving you much in the way of much to do as part of this visual novel except read and look at the visuals behind it, which, if I hadn't made clear with Saya no Uta, is kind of a bummer when your visual novel doesn't really allow you much of a choice in the matter of what ends up happening, and the choices you make are minimal at best. This is to say that while the concepts of vengeance begets vengeance and cyberpunk dystopia aesthetics are good for a beginning, he do all of this to much better effect in his later works, and being honest here, there's only so much build-up I can do from here with these two works specifically. So let's get down to it. Let's talk about the work that arguably made Gen Urobuchi's career proper to start out, Fate/Zero. So, when Fate/Zero first started getting written in 2006, it was done with the express want of the creator of its predecessor Fate Stay Night and co-founder of Type Moon, Takashi Takeuchi, to write this, having been pitched the idea for it as soon as FSN's original release in 2004. Urobuchi, however, pitched the concept of Fate/Zero to the team at Type Moon, with most of the concepts being approved by the team in question, and even being given creative freedom over how the characterization of minor character and adoptive father to main character Shiro Emiya, Kiritsugu Emiya, would be portrayed. But, without going into the details of the creation of Fate/Zero too much, as I both don't want to bog down or distract myself too much from the general focus of Gen Urobuchi's stories from this video, but also because I want to save it for when I eventually talk about the Fate franchise in its own right, as that's just the passion, but it's also just deserving of being talked about at its own merits. That being said, this one is the first example I could clearly point to when the concepts of previously mentioned points in his earlier works can be found in a much more constrained and much better written way, as the way that Urobuchi takes characters from the original Fate Stay Night who either had major importance and defined characteristics, or those only mentioned in passing and only had a couple bits and bobs mentioned by the other characters in it. And he just puts them all through the ringer in a way that would make you think he's being edgy for the sake of being edgy, and somehow makes you either really love these characters a lot more for it, or makes you reconsider everything you knew about these characters in question. It's an absolute masterclass on how to flip the existing continuity of a franchise on its fucking head in the best way possible. And given that this was done so soon into the run of Fate being a franchise for Type Moon, and well before it would become the ever-looming monolith of a franchise we know it as today, it's an impressively good work given it was written specifically for someone who had zero involvement in the franchise to begin with. Which is to say, the way Urobuchi twists the story of the prequel events to Fate Stay Night through his portrayal of the already mentioned horrid events of the Fourth Holy Grail War, which took place 10 years prior to the events of FSN, and creates a twisted tale of vengeance, misery, and family warfare, all while establishing the events which would shape future and current main players of the franchise at the time, such as Shira, Rin, Ilya, and Sakura, all the while establishing certain characters like Gilgamesh, Kyrie Kotomine, and especially Kiritsugu Emiya, and showing how they came to be in the Fifth Holy Grail War, how they fell to the dark side, or how their lives fell apart as a result of the Grail War itself. Additionally, the fact he also manages to make some smaller parts that were referenced or used in FSN, such as the crest worms, become a much more frightening and disgusting concept as part of the story in Fate/Zero, is a perfect example here of utilizing a previous writing and visual style to greater effect. To say nothing of how he manages to twist the knife even further with Nightmare Fuel at the times of the back half of the series. As much like his other works, he has a bit of a habit over making certain characters throughout the series suffer unimaginably horrible, yet completely relevant fates to have you know for a fact that shit is about to go south from this moment on. And yeah, Lance's ultimate fate in this, arguably one of the hardest and guttural moments in the entire Fate franchise, is that moment in all honesty. Because once the events of that episode where it takes place happens, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. This isn't to say that things weren't fucked up beforehand, mind you. I just feel it best to use that particular one as an example, as the rest of the examples I could use are either ones I cannot show in good faith lest I have this video demonetized, or I won't show you so you can experience this series on your own. And to be absolutely clear, you should 100% check this series out for yourself if you're either already belonging to the Fate fandom or someone who has yet to dip their toes in the franchise for the first time. I'd argue it to be one of the highlights of the Fate franchise next to the anime adaptations of Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel, both of which build off this adaptation given all three were animated by Ufotable. And if you like the way they animate the likes of Demon Slayer, you'll adore the three mentioned, and especially Fate Zero. And yet, what if I told you that this would even be his biggest success story? Because that technically would come just a year and a half earlier with Madoka Magica. What more can I really say but that alone? Well, a lot, that's really kind of the point here. But given the fact that this at one point was one of the most popular anime of all time back in the 2010s when it debuted, some may wonder today why it's gotten such a reputation that it does now, given that it looks on the surface like your run-of-the-mill magical girl anime. Well, you know how I said that Urobutcher loves to lead you in with a nice cutesy premise only to bear trap you as part of the series early on? This is where the trend properly started for him. Because yes, it does indeed start off as life as your typical magical girl series, even down to having the slightly ditz of a main protagonist who may or may not be fated to save the world as a magical girl with a strange dream telling her of her potential fate, meeting a few senior magical girls, and then being introduced to this cute marketable plushie on how she can become one. And then episode 3 happens. Yeah, you know how I was just talking about how every series by Gen having that one moment where there's a complete tonal shift? This meme-to-death image is the turning point of Madoka Magica as it drops the facade almost immediately and takes a turn for the grim, even down to the credit sequence changing drastically. And while a lot of people seem to write off this series as being grimdark for the sake of grimdark or being torture-prone for the magical girls, I simply have to say that if you write it off as that and that alone, you're missing the overall point of this show. That while yes, there are many reasons to want to save the world, the most important reason shouldn't be due to some fated destiny or someone else's pressure into it, but of your own volition. And Madoka and its sequel movie Rebellion kind of established this as the backbone which makes this arguably one of the best modern magical girl animes of all time. To the point that, when you look up all of the awards that this series has won in its span of time between 2011 and 2014, you need to scroll down at least a few pages to name them all. But the highlights of that include the Best TV Series at the 16th Animation Kobe Awards, Grand Prize at the 15th Japan Media Arts Fest Awards, Best Series Director and Screenplay at the 11th Tokyo Anime Awards, not to mention Rebellion winning Best Theatrical Anime at the 19th Kobe Awards, and Anime of the Year at the 13th Tokyo Anime Awards. Which is to say, there's a reason that the term post-Madoka Magical Girl has become such a topic of discussion, as a lot of animes in its wake have attempted to redo a similar formula to Madoka Magica, such as Yuki Yuta as a Hero and Magical Girl Racing Project, which to their credit have tried to put their own spin of things into the mix, but haven't reached that same height. And then you just have animes that try to copy the grimdark magical girl formula in differing ways that either don't work and make things more nonsensical as a result like Granbelm, or they just make the actual magical girl torture prone like others believe Madoka to be, like in Magical Girl's Sight. Point is, Madoka Magica was such an event within the sphere of influence of modern anime that many animes after, and still to this day, cite it as an influence, to the point where even though there was a spin-off series based upon a gacha anime from 2019 to 2022, the announcement of a sequel movie to Rebellion sparked such rave reactions from people online, it felt like I was transported back to 2012 or 2013 anime fandom all over again. However, like Fate Zero, I will stress that while this series is quite expansive, and I could talk on for hours about how to go about it with being so great, I would argue watching it for yourself is honestly the best way of enjoying it, because of similar reasons for the rest of this list. Demonetization and wanting you to watch it for yourself. But this is also where I gotta say that for the rest of this video, it gets a bit muddy on the content side of things, as while the next few series are certainly still very good, a lot of people have debatability on if these are as good as the ones we've just talked about. A prime example being While the last two were probably perfect examples of what Urobuchi was trying to do with the stuff like Sai no Uta, I'd argue that Psycho-Pass was him trying to focus on the cyberpunk themes and aesthetics that he was trying to pull out in Kikokugai. As Psycho-Pass has been described as an anime version of the movie Minority Report meets Ghost in the Shell, and while that is certainly a generalizing statement you could make about a series like this, it's unfortunately not off the mark, as it takes this aspect in the scanning of people's minds that feels eerily similar to the likes of the precogs of Minority Report and the futuristic police task force aspects from Ghost in the Shell. And while I could go off many different aspects between the two, pick it apart and say this is a wholly unoriginal concept and it's very propaganda kind of show, I do think that much like its predecessors, it's still one that holds a variable amount of merit. I mean, it's been going on for nearly a decade at this point, and eclipsed Madoka Magica in terms of Urobuchi's longest-running franchise by series continuations alone, so that has to count for something in the grander scheme. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be focusing primarily on Season 1, as this is the one he has a primary hand in the creative process on, and after this entry, he begins to have less and less influence on the story other than being the original concept creator. Now, in regards to this being basically the anime equivalent of Minority Report, the story itself does very much make it seem like it's going down that route of cop ends up being picked up by the system and has to outsmart his own forced to survive plot. But in a stunning way of being able to subvert that expectation and even look at it in a much better light, with our main protagonist in Akane literally starting out her first day on the job in the first episode and seeing her adapt to the role as a member of Division 1 in the Criminal Investigation Department, with her partner, dubbed an enforcer, being a criminal known as Kogami. The series explores the nature of criminals and law enforcement through the developing nature between these two in a way that kind of makes you wonder at times if Gen is trying to talk about how fucked the police system is at times. But before I have people trying to psychoanalyze my feelings on law enforcement in my videos again, let's try and remain on track. The main thing of focus here is that there's a global system in place known as the Sybil system, which uses the weapons known as Dominators to scan the brain pattern of individuals and figure out if they are sound of mind or could convict a crime of some degree or are guilty of a crime. To that end, think of it like the Deca Badge scanners in Deca Ranger, or Power Rangers SPD for you filthy Americans, except it's also a gun. And like, given what we know by now of Urobuchi's work, it should surprise nobody to know that the first criminal we find in the series is someone who claims to have been down the straight and narrow all his life, suddenly gets a scan saying he's on the brainwave of a criminal, and then he decides, fuck it, why not give in? I'd use this as an example of Urobuchi's writing going down the obvious route you would expect by now, but I also use this as an example of what I feel is the biggest issue with Psycho-Pass. Because while it does try to explore the idea of morality and people's innate desires to be good people or desires to be monsters, it paints no real concrete gray area except within our main cast. Granted, from what I know of later seasons, they do try to explore that a little bit more overall with different writers at the helm, but in regards to this first season of the show, it does give the idea that once someone has gone down a specific path in life, they are beyond the ability to be helped. I say this less of a critique on this kind of show, but more of a critique on Urobuchi's writing going forward, as this isn't even the last time we'll be using that as an example of his works, which the next one on our list actually has another case of it. So yeah, Gen Urobuchi got asked to work on Kamen Rider at one point in time, and while a lot of people may look at Kamen Rider as something akin to its brother in the medium of Super Sentai, as being a show for little kids, it's only on the surface level of it, as if you look at the series at a much longer glance, yeah, let's just say that Gen was perfect to be in this position, especially given that he had come in as the writer of the series following along with the streak of 4 Kamen Rider series which arguably varied on the scale of wacky hijinks with the majority of O's and 4's to overall more mature adventures like in Double or Wizard. Yet, Urobuchi's claim to the franchise, Kamen Rider Gaim, was essentially a callback to the era before these shows came out. In particular with its Rider Battle Royale formula and taking inspiration from the Warring States period in Japan, even down to the various levels of references to it in the opening theme, flash forwards or flashbacks, and in general with the designs of the riders. With the series itself being honestly the perfect distillation of not just Gen Urobuchi's writing style, but also the perfect distillation of, at the time, the modern day Rider formula. That being taking a plucky hero as the main writer, having them go through hell alongside the dick of a secondary writer, and then things slowly fall apart as the series goes on. You know, perfect for Gen Urobuchi to write a series on. The plot itself follows 20-year-old Kazuro Makota, a former member of a dancing troupe known as Beat Writers dubbed Team Gaim, who left the team sometime after graduating high school due to him and his sister struggling financially. While he does keep in touch with the members of the team, he gets contact from one of its members, Yuya, who wishes to show him something to help benefit their dance team. But upon meeting him at the designated location, Kota only finds an opening into another world, in which he finds a rider belt and an orange lock seed, an item of which is used to summon little digital creatures known as Invest in order to fight for dance territory. From here, he's engaged in battle with a real-life Invest and is forced to use the rider belt and the lock seed he found to become Armored Rider Gaim. This basically becomes the premise of the series, with more of these armored riders becoming more and more shown throughout the series, and the mysteries surrounding the alternate world. The lock seed, and even the very mysteries of the world these people live in becoming more and more throughout the series. Again, like Fate Zero and Madoka before it, I'd recommend you watch it all for yourself to enjoy it, as I personally would consider this to be one of Gen's finest works, as well as one of the best Kamen Rider and Tokusatsu shows period I have ever watched, and it needs to be seen in full to really be appreciated. However, this is an Urobuchi work. Not only that, but it's a Kamen Rider Battle Royale series, which is always filled to the brim with misery throughout it. See Kamen Rider Ryuki and Geats as examples of the latter trope. So if there was going to be anything to expect from this series, well, we've already covered the basis, so imagine Gen Urobuchi's work at a PG rating, and you've basically got it. You've got characters doomed by the narrative, you've got characters who end up slowly becoming corrupted as the series goes on until they reach a point of no return morally, you've got secret government organizations conspiring against the bad guys for a fair chunk of it, and then there's just Oren. Oren Biel Alphonse. And that actually brings me to one of the bigger critiques of this season, which actually has to do with its tonal whiplash at times. A prime example of this being around about the middle point of the season, in which Kota finds out the awful truth surrounding Yuya at the beginning of the series, a reveal of which shocks him to such a degree that he becomes so depressed he doesn't feel like he can continue on to be Gaim. This then turns into his motivation to keep, and after overcoming said self-doubt due to this, he gains his mid-season power-up despite everything becoming harder for him, and the tone becoming more and more bleak as the series goes on. And then following this emotionally draining two-parter, we get the crossover with the kid-friendly trained Sentai Tokyuger. Granted, the latter could be attested to the writing of Nobuhiro Mori, who wrote the more comical-focused episodes of the season of Kamen Rider, but the fact Gen had a hand in some of these episodes as well speaks to me that he kind of had a problem balancing the tone of what he wanted to go for versus the tone of which Rider series needed to be at times. Not only that, but while many people do consider Gaim to be one of, if not the best series of Heisei Riders, it's also seen at times to be the most polarizing given how bleak it ends up getting by the end, and how the ending of it kind of feels like a sudden gut punch by the end you finish up on it. This would later become a recurring trend for Urobuchi's later stage works, unfortunately, as shown with his next series. Well, we had to touch upon this series eventually if we were covering Urobuchi's work, but to my own personal dismay, we have to talk about Aldnoah.Zero. Gen Urobuchi's attempt to make a mecha anime in a similar vein to the likes of Code Geass, Guilty Crown, or even most Gundam of its time is certainly an admirable thing given what he's delved in before. But if I told you this is arguably where his fall from grace begins, as when it aired initially, Aldnoah.Zero was both praised and criticized for his story being a bit too ham-fisted in delving into tropes that you would come to expect from Urobuchi's writing, to the point that many felt it was coming off as a pastiche of his writing rather than writing from the man himself. I mean, the world we're in starts as our 2014 progressively getting into the middle of a war with a race of Martians known as the Verse, and the moon being half destroyed Sonic Adventure 2 style as a result of it. This event being dubbed Heaven's Fall, happening 19 years prior to the series events. While the series events continue progressing throughout the stages of the conflict following along from the Verse Princess' supposed demise at the hands of a terrorist attack that was planned out by the alien army themselves, the struggle with a series like this, to be blunt, is that unlike its contemporaries, its way of viewing things in a black and white setting makes it hard to feel like there's to be a deeper meaning. As you have the Verse, who are an obviously horrible evil empire-style villains who use the who use a staged terrorist attack to incite their 15-year pledge attack on Earth into finally happening now they have a good cause for it. And you have the denizens of Earth who are rightfully trying to defend themselves from this, and while there is some kind of interesting moralities on both sides of it, I couldn't tell you if there's a proper grey morality, if not just black and white. And that is a serious problem with Gen's works that becomes tiresome after he trudges it around from Psychopaths into Gaim, and then further into the series. Then once you've seen enough of his works, it almost becomes like a bingo of spot the Urobuchi tropes. And it also doesn't surprise me that people begin to tire of it around about Aldnoah.Zero, because this series arguably was the worst that Gen Urobuchi ever put to paper. I mean, when the ending of its first half aired and people were quick to dismiss the entire series off the cliffhanger that ended it off in such a way that they either didn't come back for its second half beginning in 2015 or flat out used it as a reason why the second half stunk so badly, you could tell it was time for some kind of change to happen for Urobuchi. So where exactly did he go after this whole mess? Well, for the next 7 years after Aldnoah's second half, Urobuchi would end up working on several different adaptations of various video game adaptations such as Gunslinger Stratos the animation, Chaos Dragon, which is based upon the Red Dragon RPG game series, and the original Net animation series, Obsolete. As you can tell from the above, the quality of the series that he was putting his name on began to fluctuate wildly in terms of acclaim and general style after a good long while, but this only led to the sentiment that the Urobutcher had finally met his match and couldn't do it anymore. And then, out of bloody nowhere, he had his name attached to the Ruby anime story Ice Queendom as a member of the animation concept team, giving many people a shock as they didn't expect his name to be attached to something like Ruby, and were especially shocked at how his involvement ended up being given how Ice Queendom ended up being. Following along from that, he then penned his most recent work in Revenger, which released only just last year, following the story of a samurai who was tricked into killing his father, and becomes intertwined into the society of similar people seeking revenge on those who have wronged them in life, known as Revengers, to do so for his own reasons. That gotta be said, however, I do gotta agree that this really is just a paint-by-numbers Urobuchi series, and it started to show me and many others that Gen was seemingly starting to lose what made his earlier work so special and so amazing to begin with, many including myself beginning to write him off as entirely as a writer given the last truly thing he had given us was... And then it was like a sign from Madoka herself that maybe the Urobutcher wasn't done yet, as the first proper trailer for Madoka Magica while Poker Night Rising came out at the end of 2023, with many, including myself, feeling that same level of desire that we did for Rebellion a decade earlier. Time will only tell with Rising's release if Gen Urobuchi has truly lost his touch after returning to the franchise that arguably made him the juggernaut he is known as today. If it flops, maybe his time as an established writer really has come and gone. If Rising succeeds, however, maybe it's a sign that Urobuchi's legacy isn't as over as many of us think it to be, and he still might have a few more interesting stories to tell underneath his glare. For now, only time will tell when the Urobuchi will strike again, and whether it's a matter of when, not if, he will force us to view his next tragedy for our time. This video was made possible through supporter patrons like the ones you're seeing on screen right now. If you like videos like this one and others on this channel, please consider supporting them via the Patreon link and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for the time, and catch you later.